Good morning, everyone. It's Mr. Jeff from the Ridgewood Public Library. I hope you're all doing well and staying happy and healthy at home with your families. Today, we're going to be starting and ending with an activity and reading a book in between. But first, we have to start with our good morning song. So we're going to say hello to the girls, then the boys, and then the grown-ups. Are you ready? Here we go. Hello, everybody. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Hello, everybody. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed, my darling. Hello to the girls. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Hello to the girls. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed, my darling. Hello to the boys. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Hello to the boys. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed, my darling. Hello to the grown-ups. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Hello to the grown-ups. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed, my darling. All right, welcome and good morning. So, today's theme is all about being messy, but then getting clean. So we're going to start off with a fun little rhyme about the importance of washing our hands. And this is all the little germs. All the little germs, dirty and mean, hiding on your palms where they cannot be seen. Wash them, scrub them, and rinse them away. Then we'll have clean hands. Hip, hip, hooray! All right, great job, great job. Now, let's read all about messiness in Mr. Messy. Well, he sure looks messy to me. Let's jump right in to read all about Mr. Messy's messy life. Mr. Massey was the messiest person you've ever met in your whole life. He looked messy because he was messy in everything he did. You could always tell where Mr. Massey had been because he left a trail of messy fingerprints wherever he'd been. Oh yes, Mr. Massey was messy by name, messy by nature. Mr. Massey lived in a particularly messy-looking house. The paint was peeling. The windows were broken. There were tiles missing from the roof. The flower beds were overgrown with weeds. The garden gate was off its hinges. And had Mr. Massey cut the grass in his garden lately? He had not. One morning, Mr. Massey woke up in his messy bed, yawned, scratched, got up, cleaned his teeth, leaving the top off the toothpaste, had his breakfast, spilling cornflakes all over the floor, and then set out for a walk, tripping over a brush he'd left lying in the garden 2 weeks before. There was a wood behind Mr. Massey's messy house with the messy garden, and that's where he went for his walk. It was a particularly large wood with lots and lots of trees, and it took Mr. Massey a long time to walk through it, but he didn't really mind because he felt like walking that morning. So he walked and walked right through the wood until he came to the other side. And do you know what he found on the other side of the wood? What do you think he found? Take a guess. Mr. Massey found the neatest, prettiest looking little cottage that he had ever seen. It had a lovely little garden with a stream running through the middle of it. There was a man in the garden clipping the hedge. He looked up as Mr. Massey approached. "Good morning. I'm Mr. Massey," said Mr. Massey. "I can see that," replied the man, looking him up and down. "I'm Mr. Tidy, and I'm Mr. Neat," said another man, appearing out of the house. "Tidy and neat," said Mr. Tidy. "Neat and tidy," said Mr. Neat. "We're in business together," explained Mr. Tidy, "and the people who own this house have asked us to do some work for them." "What sort of work?" asked Mr. Massey. "Oh, we make things nice and neat," said Mr. Neat. "Tidy things up," added Mr. Tidy. "Perhaps we could come along and do some work for you," said Mr. Neat, looking at Mr. Massey, who was looking even messier than usual that particular morning. "But I don't want things neat and tidy," said Mr. Massey, looking downright miserable at the thought of it. "Nonsense," said Mr. Tidy. "Fiddlesticks," said Mr. Neat. "But," said Mr. Massey. "Come along," said Mr. Neat. "Off we go," said Mr. Tidy. But, said Mr. Massey. "But nothing," said Mr. Neat, and bundling him into their van, which was parked behind the house, off they went to Mr. Massey's house at the other side of the wood. "Good heavens," said Mr. Neat when he saw where Mr. Massey lived. "Good gracious me," added Mr. Tidy. "This is the messiest house I have ever seen in all my born days," they both said together at the same time. "Better do something about it," said Mr. Neat, and before Mr. Massey could open his mouth, the two of them were rushing here and there about Mr. Massey's house. Mr. Neat hoed and mowed and pruned and snipped and clipped and cleared and dug and made the garden look neater than it had ever looked before. Mr. Tidy cleaned and primed and rubbed and painted and mended and made the outside of Mr. Massey's house look tidier than it had ever looked before. Then they both went inside the house. "Good heavens," said Mr. Neat for the second time that morning. "Good gracious," said Mr. Tidy for the second time that morning. And then they set about cleaning the house from top to bottom. They brushed and swept and polished and scrubbed and made the inside of the house look neater and tidier than it had ever looked before. "There we are," said Mr. Tidy. "All finished," said Mr. Neat. "Tidy and neat," said Mr. Tidy. "Neat and tidy," said Mr. Neat. Mr. Massey just didn't know what to say. Then they both looked at Mr. Massey. "Are you thinking what I'm thinking?" Mr. Neat said to Mr. Tidy. "Precisely," replied Mr. Tidy. "What we're both thinking," they said together to Mr. Massey, "is that you look much too messy to live in a neat and tidy house like this." "But," said Mr. Massey, but whatever Mr. Massey said was no use, and Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy whisked him off to the bathroom upstairs. It had been the messiest room in the house, but now, of course, it was neat as a new pin. Then Mr. Neat got hold of one of Mr. Massey's arms, and Mr. Tidy got hold of the other arm, and they picked him up and put him straight into the bath. Mr. Massey wasn't used to having baths. Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy washed and brushed and cleaned and scrubbed and combed Mr. Massey until he didn't look like Mr. Massey at all. In fact, he looked the opposite of messy. He looked at himself in the mirror. "You know what I'm going to have to do now," he said in a rather fierce voice. Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy looked worried. What is Mr. Massey going to have to do now? What do you think? "What are you going to have to do?" they asked Mr. Massey. "I'm going to have to change my name," said Mr. Massey. And then he chuckled, and Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy chuckled, and then Mr. Massey laughed, and Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy laughed, and then they had all laughed together and became the best of friends. And that really is the end of the story, except to say that if you're a messy sort of person, you might have a visit from 2 people. And you know what they're called, don't you? Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy. All right, great listening. Next on the board here, we're going to take a trip to the farm where there's 5 squeaky clean pigs. And there they are. Let's count them up. Ready? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 pigs, right? But uh-oh, what's this over here? I see mud. Let's see how long these pigs stay clean. Are you ready? Here we go. 5 pigs, so squeaky clean. Cleanest you've ever seen. Wanted to go outside and play. Oink, oink. One jumped into the mud, landed with a big thud. Then there were 4 clean squeaky pigs. Let's count them up. Ready? 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 pigs, so squeaky clean. Cleanest you've ever seen. Want to go outside and play. Oink, oink. One jumped into the mud, landed with a big thud. Then there were 3 clean squeaky pigs. Let's count them up. Ready? Here we go. 1, 2, 3. 3 pigs, so squeaky clean. Cleanest you've ever seen. Want to go outside and play. Oink, oink. One jumped into the mud, landed with a big thud. Then there were 2 clean squeaky pigs. Let's count them up. Ready? Here we go. 1, 2. 2 pigs, so squeaky clean. Cleanest you've ever seen. Wanted to go outside and play. Oink, oink. One jumped into the mud, landed with a big thud. Then there was 1 clean squeaky pig. Let's count them up. Ready? Here we go. 1, just 1 pig. Here we go. 1 pig, so squeaky clean. Cleanest you've ever seen. Wanted to go outside and play. Oink, oink. He jumped into the mud, landed with a big thud. Then there were no clean squeaky pigs, right? No pigs left. All right, here we go. No pigs so squeaky clean. Cleanest you've never seen. Farmer came around later that day. Scrub-a-dub-dub. 5 pigs clean from the mud, gathered around for a hug. Now there were 5 clean squeaky pigs. Oink, oink. All right, great job, right? Those pigs got cleaned right back up. All right, that's just about all the time we have for today. We're going to sing our goodbye song now, all right? Here we go. Well, my hands say thank you with the clap, 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 and my feet say thank you with the tap, 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 clap, 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 tap, tap, tap. I shake my hands and say goodbye. Thanks so much for tuning in, and I can't wait to see you all again real soon. Bye!